Hi, this is Carl Irwin with another tutorial. We're going to take a slightly different direction in Qtractor today, but this will be an audio sequencing, digital audio workstation tutorial dealing with Qtractor. In the past, we've looked at a couple of different instrument platforms from which we can play sampled instruments. We looked at LMMS as an instrument platform that was external to Qtractor, where we could route our MIDI signals through MIDI buses to LMMS to actuate instruments, various instruments. We've also looked at Linux Sampler as an instrument platform for sampled sound types of instruments, either in Giga format or in SFZ or SF2, which is what we mostly use here on these tutorials anyway. And we compared and contrasted those two. So far, it looks like, to me, Linux Sampler is the more robust setup and platform for using specifically sampled sound instruments, and really that's all it can do. It doesn't do any other kind of instrumentation. LMMS has some limitations, as you recall, with Midi routing, where all automation gets its own channel, and you very quickly run out of your 16 available channels per LMMS session. Whereas with Linux Sampler and the JSampler front end, Fantasia, the Java program front end, you get really an unlimited number of MIDI connections, and automation via controller automation is automatically routed to the channel that it is designated to. Unlike in LMMS, where you have your channel MIDI input, but then you also have additional channels for all controller automation. The nice thing about Linux Sampler is that you didn't have these limitations, but the downfall was that it was a little bit cumbersome to use. You are prone to some crashes, and the front end has a tendency to sever itself from the back end, and you have to be saving quite frequently. The nice thing about both of those is that they have very good persistence in Qtractor. We're going to look at another one today. We're going to look at Carla, and I've talked about Carla before, and Carla has been a bit of a headache for me trying to use Carla, and I'll show you what that is very quickly. This is on the KX Studio website, their Carla page, and I'm not really sure where the real Carla page is at, where the project page. I guess the project pages are down here, but on GitHub. But the best information really is on KX Studio. As far as a description of what it is. I have never liked Carla because it's just so frustrating and aggravating to use. My experience using the stable repositories and the KX Studio repositories is that the program just doesn't work that well. It crashes frequently. Plugins crash it. They don't load. Common plugins that you'd think you'd want to use. There are a lot of third-party plugins that have been made for it, and rarely do they ever work in it. Things that it's supposed to do, it can't, like when you're in the Patchbay mode and you should have multiple MIDI signals coming into various instruments. It will only play one instrument, and it'll only play the first one that you created in the rack. Just a lot of very weird things with Carla, until I got curious enough to look on the KX Studio page, and I noticed down at the bottom I had been looking for an app image for Carla, because I was finding that app images, image portable renditions of programs or binaries, have been far more stable on my Linux system than the stable repository installations. I don't know why that is, but it's true of almost every single program I use. Blender is more stable as a binary. LMMS is more stable in its app image format. MuseScore is far more stable in its app image format. Qtractor is more stable in its app image format. At least that's been my experience on my Linux systems. So I wondered if the same was true for Carla, if it had a portable or a pre-compiled binary that might give me better results. So I looked on KX Studio's page, and lo and behold, I never noticed it before, but down here are pre-compiled binaries available for Linux, Mac, and Windows. So I downloaded the one that was relevant to me, my 64-bit binary, and I tried to load up Carla with a Qtractor session. And I was pleasantly surprised to find that it works really well. It works very well. I wasn't getting any of the instability that I had been experiencing before. Suddenly, third-party plugins were working. Midi routing was flawless. Things were going where they were supposed to be. I could put in a large number of instruments on a rack and using the Patchbay mode, and they would all play back. In fact, they played back even better than Linux Sampler, given the same format. So now the thing with Carla is that it is limited to 16 MIDI channels, but each MIDI channel can be routed such that you don't have to use extra MIDI channels coming out of Qtractor and into Carla for particular controllers. A single MIDI channel will route completely MIDI input data and controllers and all to one instrument without sacrificing any channels. And you have the stability that you had in LMMS to run many of the plugins that were available in the LMMS instrument platform. So kind of the best of both worlds here. Now some issues, however, I will point out with Carla, just some things that we need to be aware of. Carla has some issues with its interface that are kind of unusual. You can't really organize things very well. It has some options in the graphic user interface to change color to sort of organize various modules that you put on the rack. But I find that the colors, they stick to that location rather than to the instrument. So as soon as you start moving instruments up or down and around, the colors start jumping to other modules, so that's a little strange. It's kind of a thing that you probably want to do when you're done with your project and everything is where it's supposed to be. Then you can color code it for easy access and recognition as you're using your rack. So that's kind of one of those things that probably doesn't work as intended. It's still useful maybe in a sense, though. Once you get it all put together, you can then color code it and make it look nice and pretty and clean so that as you're referencing it, you can see things quickly. Another big issue with Carla, but it has a cost. You can do this, but there's a cost, is that with MIDI routing, it does not have multiple MIDI inputs. Now that's a good thing in one respect, because if you remember on LMMS, every instrument had its own MIDI input that had to be patched from Jack's Patchbay. Now the good news was that with LMMS there was persistence between loading. So once you made all those connections, you could load up Qtractor again and LMMS, and the session would be saved, and all of those MIDI routing patches will then come up in your session. Carla does not do that very well. However, because there's only one MIDI input, it's a very simple fix when the persistence fails, and it fails most of the time. It's very difficult to have to save the persistence when using Carla in Qtractor in Jack. You really only have to patch a couple things each time you load up the session, so it's not a big deal. You just have to make two patches, one for the audio, one for the MIDI, and delete a couple of other patches that Carla creates. For some reason, Carla always wants to patch to the system output. Even when you try to save a session, it creates patches that you didn't create when you turn it on, when you load it up and load in your project. And it also fails to recognize some of the things that you've saved in your session as well. So persistence is a bit of a problem. But again, there's only one MIDI input. Now the problem with that is that with one MIDI input, one bus input, on the other side, the instruments, and as they were written for Carla, do not recognize which MIDI track they are supposed to be using. There's no way to set a MIDI channel in an instrument in Carla so that it knows to only take MIDI data from that particular channel from the 16 available channels coming in. Now, there are third-party plugins that have been created, however, called channel filters, and the channel filters allow you to then turn off all of the channels that you don't want to use and maintain just the channel that you do. Now the problem with that is that you need to make a channel filter for all 16 channels. So on your rack you have to have 16 separate modules that are just a channel filter before you can even really get started loading in instruments and patching them properly. Now that is a bit of a cost, but at the same time what you can do is make a template with your MIDI patches already pre-created, and then just load in that template to start each new session. And then that's legwork that you only have to do one time, you don't ever have to do again. We'll look at that here in a moment. So that's the cost, but it's probably a cost worth it to do it. One other thing that Carla does that we could do in LMMS, but we couldn't do in Linux Sampler, was we can use various instruments that are instruments in and of themselves. They're not just samplers. You can even use VST like you could in LMMS. Now, let me just share my feelings about bridging Windows VSTs in Linux via Wine, Windows compatibility layer. Here's my feeling on it. Doing that is hit or miss. Okay. So using the WINE-bridge in LMMS and also in Carla inside of Linux for Windows VSTs, it's hit or miss, but it's mostly miss. It's mostly miss. Those little programs were not created to be run in a compatibility layer. They were created to run on a system. And the compatibility layer, as much development as goes on in it, with it, and as frequent as it is updated, it changes so frequently, you're missing most of the time, and oftentimes VSTs are not fully functional. So that being said, it is not worth it, in my opinion, ever to use Windows VSTs in Linux using the bridge capability. It just isn't worth it, because 9 times out of 10, more like 99 times out of 100, there are alternative ways to achieve the same result. Either there are better samples, or better sound fonts, better SFZs, better Giga, libraries, or better Linux native LV2s, VSTs, or whatever that are native to Linux that just work better and do the same thing or better. Very rarely have I found something that I wanted to get from a Windows VST that I couldn't find some way to get it in Linux using something native to Linux. Now, I say all of that, right? It's hit or miss, but mostly miss, and it's not worth the trouble. Just use an alternative. But sometimes special circumstances can work. So, that being said, hey, if you find a VST that works in the WINE-bridge and you can get some sort of effect, by using that's much easier than doing some alternative, then do it. And I'm going to show you one on here. This is not merely just a tutorial about Carla and using Carla and a walkthrough using Carla in Qtractor. I want to show you a couple of the benefits that Carla gives us, mostly because of this little VST thing. We can run Windows VSTs in there if you wanted to. There's a bit of a caveat to that, but let's take a look. One VST we're going to look at is this one, DSK Music. If you're not aware of this company, DSK Music makes free VST instruments and more, as the website says. These VST instruments are kind of older school. A lot of these are fairly old. They've been around for many years, some of them over 10 years. But they're really, really good for what they are. The saying goes, you get what you pay for. Sometimes you get a lot more than what you pay for, as we know using open source software and Linux. Things that are community developed in particular are usually much better than some sort of freebie cheapo thing that you can get without paying anything. There's a lot of passion that has gone into creating those open source projects. This is not an open source project. It's just free, but there's a lot of passion that has gone into it, and it's pretty evident. These instruments are really, really good on Windows in particular. And when they do work on Linux, they may be worth using. We're just going to look at this one, DSK SF2. This is actually the older one. This is version 2 down here that we're looking at. And you can see it has a Portamento feature, and that's what we're really interested in this. We want to be able to use a sort of pitch bend feature that is not available to us in Linux. Now, we have sound font players in Linux. We have them in LMMS. We have them even in Carla here. And of course, Linux Sampler is a sound font player as well, or has a sound font player. But none of them have the Portamento ability. And this is a really nice a feature because it treats the sampler as really any other sampler that we have in Linux that does have this pitch bend feature. It can take the wave sample that's being played and it can bend it to a new note. And this is important because in real situations, like on a string instrument and even on some wind instruments, and for example trombone specifically, but even other wind instruments as well, there is a moment in time in legato playing, connected notation, when you're going from one note to another, where you'll hear that movement between the two notes. On a string instrument, you can actually move the finger from one fingering to another while the bow is still moving, and you'll hear that slide very, very quickly and subtly there between the notes. It would be nice to be able to do that in some legato playing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play for you an example project that I have here, and you can see what we're getting at. This is actually being run through Carla. Just a very simple, underdeveloped string idea here. And I'll talk about it compositionally here just briefly in a moment. But here's my Carla session. You can see this mess up here of MIDI channels, 12 MIDI channels that I'm using, and I'll explain how this works here in a moment. But I've got 3 instruments for the violins. Violin 1, 2 instruments for the second violins, 2 instruments for the violas, 2 instruments for the cello section, 3 instruments for the basses. And this covers the whole string orchestra, and I'm up to 12 MIDI channels, and this is with controller automation as well, coming from Qtractor and then into Carla. Now you'll notice that some of these are labeled port for Portamento. This is actually the DSK SF2 player on these cases. The other ones are just the regular generic sound font player inside of the fluid synth player inside of Carla. One rule here I think that you want to follow when doing this is only use the VST in the locations where you actually need to use it. Don't just use them for every single instrument. Just use them when you need it for the feature that you need it for. That way you keep the system resources low as you're using them. So there's 1 loaded here, there's 1 loaded down here, that's 2, there's 3, and then 4. So I have 4 instances of this VST loaded in. Now, you'll notice that when we compare this playback to the Linux sampler playback that we've been looking at, I have all these instruments and they all play perfectly without any interruption. That is one big benefit to using Carla over the Linux sampler kind of scenario, is that it is just a little bit more robust, a little bit more powerful in its playback features. So let's play this back and we'll talk briefly about what's going on and how to use this feature. So briefly, a few things about Carla before we look at the project itself. So you load up Carla. Again, I'm loading from the binary package that I got off of the KX Studio website. This is more stable than the KX Studio repository build and more stable than the stable build that's out in the general repositories for my distribution. What I have here are MIDI channel filters. Now the way that you get to these is you click Add Plugin, and then if you look here under, I started to type in channel, there are several versions of this. I found that the best one, in my opinion, was this one here, MIDI channel filter by Robin Garius, must be. This is seems to be the more stable version. So load this in, and then I'll show you what it looks like. The interface is quite simple. Like with the other soundfont players and other instruments, it allows you to designate, this is really funny to me, it allows you to designate the MIDI control channel. So 1, because this is channel 1, I want all of my MIDI control events to go through channel 1 and to play back on this instrument. I want to send control changes, so I click on that as well. Well, it's strange to me that the instruments in Carla have this feature, but they don't have a feature where it indicates what channel does MIDI input. So that's very bizarre to me. I just don't get it why that oversight happened. But you do want to indicate what the control channel is going to be, and it should correspond with the channel that you're using. Make sure it's sending control channels. And then under parameters, you can indicate which channels you want to map where. If we take a look at these, we'll see a very strange thing. Doesn't make sense to me. But the parameters seem to have all turned back on again for all of these, and yet it still seems to persist in the original settings that I had. So the original settings that you have, and I don't have an explanation for this. It's wonky open source stuff, but it does still seem to work and maintains persistence. What you would do is you would enable which channel you want to filter through by leaving it on or off. 1 means on, 0 means off. And then that would send through to the other side. I don't know what this necessarily means, but what I tried to do is correspond my channel number here with the channel number that I'm sending through, just in case that mattered. I don't know why they all show everything is on, because it does seem to persist from the setup that I gave it initially when I saved my file down. But anyway, your guess is as good as mine. It is a pretty powerful way to map, though, just very time sensitive. Like I said, you can probably make your file a template with all of your MIDI channels already enabled, and then just load that in first. If you look at the patch bay, here's what it looks like. And if we look, maybe I can zoom out a bit. What we have is we have our MIDI input coming in to my MIDI channel 1 filter, and then that goes to my channel 1 instrument, and then that comes down. What I did is I took all of my Portamento and single solo sounds into a stereo enhancer, CAF stereo enhancer, and then I sent that out to my audio. And then all of my other ensemble instrument sounds I sent directly to the audio output, and I actually set those in pan controls inside of Qtractor for the mixing. But anyway, this is the setup. So these are all of my filters. The filters are going to the instruments, then the instruments are coming to the audio out. Up to 16 instruments per Qtractor or per Carla session, and you can open multiple Carla sessions. So you could have a session just for one major section of an orchestration, and then have another one for another one if you have more than 16 channels. But that's pretty much it. That's the setup. And then I have down here my instruments lined up, and again, you can change the color, come up here, change color. The strange thing is that when you then move these around, though, the colors don't go with them, so it's kind of bizarre. But anyway, that's Carla, very basically how it works using these VSTs here, just the ones that I need. Let's look at the VST real quick just to see how this works. If I load up the VST, what you want to do is you want to make sure that you set your, and there does seem to be persistence too with the settings on this, which is nice. I was a little concerned about that, but it does save in the session. You want to take your ADSR envelope and turn up the attack so that the attack is a little more gradual. I find that there's a little bit of a clicking noise in this. It's, again, free, so there's going to be some idiosyncrasies you got to deal with. Turn up the attack so it's a little bit slower, and turn up the sustain all the way to the top. And then you can set your master level here. I keep it pretty high. I also turn up the release a little bit to give a little bit of a taper on the end. And then over here, this is the magic sauce. You want to make sure the mono mode is on. Turn off the retrigger so it's not retriggering the note when it goes from one note to the next with the Portamento. And then you want to turn up your Portamento about halfway. Now, the way this works is that if we look inside at this track, any notes that are overlapping will apply the Portamento effect. So notes that are not touching, and you do need to select all your notes and put a little bit of a gap between them, because I found that the VST has some issues differentiating some notes if they go right next to each other. So put a little bit of a gap in there, and then take the notes you want to have the effect and overlap them slightly. You can overlap ahead or a little bit behind, either way. And then whenever it reads those notes, it will play the effect back. Now, one thing I did is you don't want this to be very overt. You want it to be kind of a subtle effect, as it really would be. You wouldn't really hear that loudly in a real situation. It's just kind of an underlying sort of sensation that you get, that sliding of the notes. One thing that I did is I took my velocity down for those notes that are doing the Portamento effect. So there's slightly quieter notes, the first note and the second note. And then I also, under the coarse volume, I put a little bit of a dip in the coarse volume right at the moment that that Portamento is actuating, so that it would sound a little bit more realistic. So you have to do a little bit of sequence programming here to make these sound probably as authentic as you can get. And that's it. So I applied this just to a solo instrument sound, and then I used the slow strings for the full section without the Portamento effect, and I felt that that achieved what I wanted. It's as if you're hearing some instruments in there with that, very connected sliding effect, but it's not the whole sound moving all together at once, which would sound very synthesized and unrealistic if that was going on. Another idea too, just a sidebar idea for your MIDI sequencing. I have a lot of division going on here in the violin part at the end. You can see how many notes are stacking up. Rather than have your main instrument, your section instrument, divide, which then exponentially adds instruments to your orchestration, I put the divisi on a solo set, a solo instrument. So I have a secondary solo sound, which is different from the Portamento sound, another solo violin, and I just added my doublings in that, so it sounds like one or two players are playing those divided notes. So it doesn't create that effect where the whole section is exponentially getting larger. It's as if truly a few instruments are dividing off and doing something else. So just a little tip there on dividing notes or divisi in MIDI orchestration. Use a solo instrument to achieve the divisi. So that's pretty much it. I applied the Portamento effects only on a few of these solo instruments, running them through Carla. When you load this up in subsequent loadings, you will find that in the Patchbay, a few things will happen. One thing I notice is that Carla insists on connecting to the system output. You'll want to disable that so that everything is coming through your Qtractor session. You may need to connect to the Qtractor session, again, to whatever bus you're coming in. I'm coming in on this bus over here that I made, and you can see a previous tutorial on Qtractor, the Qtractor setup with MIDI buses. And then on the MIDI side, I found that the MIDI connection is fairly persistent if you save the session in Qtractor. To do that, you go to Qtractor, click on Session, and then you save your session once you've loaded everything in to a folder by itself, and then you can load up that session later on to get your connections back. With a few extra connections, apparently, that Carla insists on having. So just be mindful of the Patchbay whenever you load up your subsequent loadings of a session that you have saved so that you can deal with those issues. So one patch, and that gets me 16 channels. That's a benefit to using this over LMMS. And all of those MIDI channels cover not just note input actuation, but also MIDI controllers as well. You can mix down in this situation, and you can see that I've mixed down here. This is the mix down track, and we can solo that and listen back, and you can hear it now, having talked about it, appreciate some of the things that we've dealt with. Just one quick note here on this. Given that the MIDI channels are not terribly persistent, what I would recommend is that you don't go in like I've done here. I suspect that if I play this back, after having opened these up, they may not work properly anymore. You probably want to just leave them alone, because if opening back up resets the persistence, then it probably will play, kind of do strange things with your instrumentation. So just something to keep in mind. Discovering this now, talking with you, to leave your channel setup, your MIDI channel filters alone once you have created them. Let's listen one more time to the piece and see if we can hear all these things I've talked about in there. So there you go, Carla instrument rack in Patchbay mode, coming out of Qtractor. We'll be experimenting a lot more, I think, with this platform in the future on subsequent projects, and mixing and matching this with some other ideas that we've already discussed in other previous tutorials. So good luck with this, and happy mixing.